Kara Jarzynski is the executive director of Revolutionaries, an organization dedicated to bringing Americans together through safe, facilitated conversation. She's formerly a facilitator for Fortune 500 companies. She turned to bridge building after the birth of her children. Never had connection, and listening felt such an importance as when she became a mom. In the time since taking the lead at Revolutionaries, she has elevated the organization to national distinction, creating key relationships with presidential centers, leading national nonprofits, and thought leaders in the civic health and civic education space, while also serving a key role in advocating for and building up a 150 plus coalition of grass top organizations in support of the Building Civic Bridges Act, legislation designed to help strengthen communities through conversation and dialogue. Kara co-chairs the Bridging Movement Alignment Council Sector Engagement Working Group and is honored to serve on the advisory board of Business for America, the advisory board of Foster Warriors, the board of directors for Team Democracy, and was recently named a DG3 co-chair for More Perfect, a bipartisan initiative working to engage institutions and Americans in protecting and renewing American democracy. And welcome.
It's
Oh,
really
goodness.
great to be here. I loved, as you were talking, seeing all the names of people saying hi and where they're from, and you guys are from everywhere. This is amazing. I love it.
Yeah, we always have a good crowd from all over the place, and it does make for a lively conversation, as well as, folks will be in the chat talking to one another about what's going on in their world. But let's talk about you for a little bit. I said that you are the executive director of Revolutionaries. Tell me how you got into this work.
Motherhood, straight up. I had always been really busy. All my life, I was someone who was doing a lot of projects at once. And when I had my kids, and I had two, I had twins, I was slowed down for the very first time.
Mhm.
And when I slowed down, they were born in 2018, which obviously was a very pivotal time in our nation's history in terms of things that had happened before and things that were getting ready to happen. And I was slower then. And I really started thinking a lot, especially as I held these two babies alone in the house, totally overwhelmed. Um, what really hit me hard was that my job as a mom wasn't just to make sure that they had food and water and shelter and education and all of those wonderful things. It was also to make sure they had a future. And that level of responsibility for me really, really, really hit home. And so as I thought about what I was going to do at some point when I went back to work, I knew that what I wanted to do had to do something with making sure that their future was as strong and viable as it could be.
Mhm.
And obviously, there were a lot of things happening politically in our world. And there was an opportunity with Resolutionaries. I knew the founder from years ago, and he really had it. Um, he was really passionate about a piece of legislation that had been introduced in the 117th Congress and did not make it out of committee. And so he approached me specifically and he said, will you help to make this bill happen? And I we knew it was going to be a really uphill battle.
Mhm.
Um, and because nobody really wants to talk about talking. No one says like, yes, that's the priority. Um, and yet, as I began to do the work, what I realized is that the growing polarization in our nation was actually having giant impact on jobs, on the economy. It was a huge national security issue, and it was impacting all of these different sectors of our life. And so, if we want strong, viable economy, if we want to not be threatened nationally, um, if we want safe communities, this really key piece is really foundational and it's actually really important. So that was part of my learning and education on this topic. And then really realizing how many experts and how much data was out there that people were saying is true, but it wasn't hitting the mainstream media. So part of what we've done is to message about that with even members of Congress. And I'll show you the people that we've talked to on the Hill, um, to educate them, and they have no idea. They have no idea. And yet it's there. It's in black and white. So we really feel like it's strong that if you have a priority of keeping people safe, of keeping our nation safe, and of making sure people are working, then you have to deal with this factor that this divide in our nation is really impacting a lot more than just Thanksgiving tables.
So he came and he asked you to help with this bill. What experience did you have with that? I mean, what made him pick you?
I will be honest, and I had this conversation with him. Um, I will answer this two ways. He came to me and asked me to do that because I knew him for 25 years. And when I was in grad school, he was an attorney and he was my landlord. And when I needed extra money, he'd employ me in his law firm. And our relationship was always, he would say, give me some giant task and say, can you just figure this out? And I'd say, okay. Um, so for one instance, there was one time there was the wall was full of bankers' boxes. And he said, I know the opposing party is hiding money. Can you figure it out? Now, usually that would be a forensic accountant, but this gentleman, his name is Dennis Cohen, it has a giant heart and he was doing a case pro bono. So he was trying to keep the costs as low as possible. So we thought, well, if Kara can figure it out, that'll keep costs low and then we can go to somebody else if we need to. Well, so that was the sort of the thing. Here's bankers boxes, find where the opposing party's hiding money and just figure it out. So that's what I would always do for him. So when he had a giant project, he called me up and he said, would you get this bill passed? And I will be quite frank, and I think that this is actually a really important point to make. He said, well, I said to him, Dennis, I don't know anybody in Washington. I've never done this work before. He said, I know. And I said, well, I don't even know where to begin. He said, I know. But any step we make in the right direction is a good step to make. And that's what I care about. I care that we're making steps. So I said, okay. And we started. And wouldn't you know, we have had a tremendous amount of success in terms of sharing the message of the impact of this topic and also helping to drive some solutions. And I'll get into that in the presentation. But I think my background on this is actually kind of important because we're living in a time when, oh gosh, we're living in a time where the problems feel really big and overwhelming. And
Mhm.
I know for myself, I just went, I don't know how to start. I don't know how to make something better, but I knew I needed to. And I
Mhm.
knew I needed to try. And I knew that I trusted in the words that he said in giving me permission to fail and in giving me permission that trying was more important than doing nothing. Yeah.
That's really pretty impressive. Because it is not an easy a battle when you have either a new topic or a topic that's controversial when you're trying to, make those appointments and go and talk to folks on the Hill or go and talk to folks locally. But it is something that is fully, I believe, the job of all of us to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, everybody on this call could do that. Everybody on this call could call their legislator, whether it's local or federal, to ask them to advocate for something.
It's been such a lesson in terms of civic engagement and
Hmm.
politics and feeling like, well, Congress doesn't care or what can I do? They're not really listening and the Washington's broken and all of those things. It's been such a lesson in learning that those offices are really hungry for solutions because they're at the end of the day, their job is to find solutions to stuff. Now, they may posture and they may say a lot of grandstanding and they may sling some stuff that's not quite great. But at the end of the day, their job is solution making.
Hmm.
And so when we show up with solutions, And one of the things we do actually is really look for people in local communities that are doing creative work to
Mhm.
solve these problems. And this is one of my favorite parts of the job, is connecting those organizations to their elected leaders and saying, hey, Congressman Scott, Senator Scott, guess what? There are people on the ground who are doing incredible work in your community, and you need to know who they are. And the
Mhm.
fact is that they actually do dive in and listen. And we have been successful in getting those elected members to show up on those local organizations' podcasts, to show up for events, to schedule bigger events later on next year.
Mhm.
So that connection between people in Washington and people on the ground has been really great. Um, and also, it's been interesting to listen to what elected officials have said in terms of their response to polarization. And I'll show you some of the numbers of who we've been messaging and how that's worked.
Well,
So
before you get started in your presentation, is there anything else you want us to know for a background piece before we dive in?
I guess, I'm not perfect and none of us are. And I don't know all the answers. No one knows all the answers, but I think stepping forward and just trying and being honest about that is really a powerful place to be. I'll share what I've learned on my journey, and I hope it's inspiring, and I'm very open to questions. All right, so here we are. The piece of legislation that our organization is lobbying for and advocating and educating elected members of Congress on is called the Building Civic Bridges Act. So we're not talking about the bridges that you drive your car over, obviously. We're talking about how do we build connections within communities? How do we build social cohesion? And how do we, in this broad, pluralistic democracy of a nation, how do we bring people who are very different together? Which obviously there's a lot of big feelings about that, is particularly after the election, and I understand that. So I'll give you some stats on polarization. And we might already know this. 70% of Americans agree that America has become so polarized that it can no longer solve the major issues facing the country. I mean, that's a problem if we're so polarized that we can't even solve things. Um, because at the end of the day, I do this for my kids. They need a future that's strong. And if we're not solving problems now, Lord knows what's going to happen in the future. 7 out of 10, doesn't matter what party you belong to, believe there's a threat to democracy and majority rule in this country. And 65% of Americans, approximately 138 million people, which if you look at the number of people who did not vote in this previous presidential election, those numbers are very closely aligned, have a wavering trust in democracy and are hesitant to engage with the other side. I don't know if that's if the numbers who didn't vote are the exact number that fit this amount of people, but it's a giant number. The impact of this on democracy, there is a writer I love. His name's Seth Kaplan. He's out of Johns Hopkins, and he is an expert on fragile states. Historically, he has worked overseas internationally. So when a democracy is beginning to fail, or when a democracy is just building up, he is a consultant that they will bring in to say, how do we shore up this democracy? How do we make it strong? He has now turned his attention to the United States, as other organizations and leaders have. And his point is really going back to communities, to the local level, neighborhoods, really, really tied in. And that's his point here. So when citizens are disconnected from neighbors and unengaged in institutions, they lack the sense of security and belonging that community brings. And when they lack that sense of belonging, then they are more likely to seek zero-sum solutions and even turn to authoritarian figures. So that sense of community belonging, in his sense, is really, really strong. And obviously, that's where the threat to democracy comes in. You'll see Condoleezza Rice has also talked about this. Americans of many stripes don't see themselves any longer in our institutions. Again, harking back to what Dr. Kaplan said about needing to be engaged in institutions. And her point was we've got to find a way to have Americans again be confident and to respect those institutions. Again, that's for shoring up democracy. This is the impact on national security. I can talk more about this later in terms of some of the national security experts who have really leaned into this. You can see this op-ed by Susan Rice, who served in Obama's administration, I believe. She wrote this in 2020, and this is not new news. This is old news. And she talked about that a divided America is a security threat that has only grown. In fact, some of the people with whom we work include General Michael Hayden, who used to lead the CIA and the NSA, and James Clapper, who was the head of national intelligence, General Stanley McChrystal, who led forces in Afghanistan, General Wesley Clark, who was the head of the NATO command, Mark Hertling and Douglas Lute, both of those were head of the armed forces in Europe, and I forget the other one's major credential, but we're talking about 3- and 4-star generals who we now work with very closely. And we work with them very closely because they are concerned about the national security threat, and it's not getting, polarization isn't getting tied to that. And so they're very happy to be messengers on that point. This point was actually echoed in last fall. There was a report that was given to the Armed Services Committee, and this is an excerpt from it. It's 100 and plus pages, this report, of what America needs to do to be prepared to face multiple foreign adversaries, all of whom have nuclear weapons. And they spend pages and pages talking about ammunition and numbers of people that need to be in the military. They're talking nuts and bolts. But they begin it all in the introduction saying, any implementation of strategy to combat multiple major nuclear adversaries must be through a whole of government strategy that must begin with, and again quotes, sustained bipartisan consensus necessary to secure a strong future and credible deterrent for the United States. They go on in very careful language, and I say very careful because they're speaking to the Armed Services Committee, to essentially call out all of Congress to say that bipartisan consensus is something that we do not presently have. And say, but we believe that you can do it. So there's our threat to national security. It also has giant impact on business and the economy. Here are just 2 headlines. The one on the right is the giant one. The cost of incivility to employers is estimated at $2 billion a day. So that's the cost of turnover because somebody doesn't want to work where they're working anymore because of their colleagues. It's the cost of colleagues not knowing how to have conversations across lines of differences and HR having to step in to help. It's also the cost of, in one business with whom we work, they've had their manufacturing line shut down because of people on that line having differences of opinions, specifically about politics. And so when they got into a fight on the line, the entire line shuts down. And so obviously that translates into dollars lost. It's also the cost of what happens if a business takes a political stance that half the country doesn't like, which obviously businesses are allowed, or CEOs or employees are allowed to take stands. So I'm not saying no one should, but all of that comes at a cost. And I will say one of the good things about that cost is it's making people pay attention. So in making people pay attention, we're able to have a deeper conversation. There is another number that's really quite startling, and that's over here on the left-hand side, when in years that polarization is high, investment in American business goes down by 27%. So that's a hidden cost. It's not something that you or I or anyone else knows. But imagine if the stock market went down by 27%, people's hair would be on fire. And so this is a giant number. And this was done by an economist out of the Federal Reserve in Virginia. Her name's Marina Azamonte, and I'm a huge fan. I never thought in my life I would say I'm a huge fan of an economist, but I have to say I am. She's amazing. And there aren't a lot of female economists in this world, and she does a lot of advocacy work to help empower her fellow female economists. So I think that's pretty groovy as well. But she's done a lot of work on partisanship and polarization and the impact on the economy. So all politics is national. What does that mean? What that means is it's not just if you go to your local community meeting or your town hall or school board or anything that you might do civically. It's not just about what's happening in that local level anymore. People are carrying a lot of messaging that they're getting from news. I heard you were doing this session on misinformation and disinformation. People are carrying a lot of extra stuff into that local moment. So what that means is it just makes it harder, it makes tensions bigger, and it makes the stakes weightier. It means that there are threats of violence. And this, as a child of an introvert, I have to say I'm particularly attuned to this. That this culture is creating one where the extreme voices are dominant. The loudest voices in the room are the ones that are being heard. And that means that a lot of times people who are introverted, and a lot of times those introverted voices are the ones that are really sitting back and really taking everything in and have a lot of wisdom to share, are not being heard. There's lower public trust and confidence in government, as we know, and increased frustrations. And then, of course, just inefficiency, which does translate for anyone who works in any sort of national service or public administration. Inefficiencies are not your friend. I will say I pulled a lot of these slides from a presentation we're giving tomorrow with the National Civic League. And I'll mention them particularly because the National Civic League was created in 1894 by President Roosevelt. And I don't know, forgive me, I don't know my history. I don't know if he was president at the time or if it was before or after, but he did it with Louis Brandeis, who of course, Brandeis University. And it was a time after the Civil War where our nation was similarly very divided and tensions were very high, and there was a lot of change. Obviously, really soon after the Industrial Revolution starts, and life just gets very different. We are living in a similar time. AI is taking over. Life is changing rapidly. Polarization is high. It's a very similar time to when the National Civic League was started. And what that organization was designed to do was to do a lot of what Dr. Kaplan talked about earlier, to go local and to connect with your neighbors. And the other reason I'll hold up this slide is because the Civic League and with the IDEA at Ohio State held in 2022 and 2024 on Capitol Hill parliamentarians, elected leaders from other countries, from 15 other countries. And the common theme, it's not just our nation, it's all of those other nations as well. There's a common theme of a lack of safety and a mistrust of constituents with government. And the reason I kept this slide in is because I just wanted to say that we're not alone. That this thing that is happening in our communities is also happening in other countries around the world. So I think as we look to sleuth it out, to figure out what do we need to do now and how do we move forward, it's helpful to know that it's happening elsewhere too, so that that way we can begin to look at what are the commonalities, what is happening here as well as there, and to see if that helps us know where to go. So solutions. Now that we talked about all this doom and gloom, let's get to what's possible. Should I, Julie, do you want me to stop here to answer any questions before I get to solutions, or do you want to,
No,
what's
we
best
can
for
keep
you?
on going and then
Keep
we'll
it
dive
going.
in.
Okay. So here's the good news. The Building Civic Bridges Act, which we're advocating for quite a bit, is efforts and initiatives that actually the US government already funds. And we fund all of these initiatives to the tune of $315 million a year, but all of that money is sent overseas to other countries. And we send it overseas to those other countries because they are democracies that are either forming, and we want to help them form to be strong, or they're democracies that are beginning to fall apart. And we know it works because that's why we fund it. But we have never funded anything here to the same degree. So the Building Civic Bridges Act would be something that would do that. It was introduced in March in the House and in the Senate in April. It was previously introduced last Congress, but it didn't make it out of committee. Reintroduced this past spring. And quite frankly, I'll be clear, it won't make it out of committee again. And there's very clear reasons for it, and I know what they are. But the good news is we're already working with the congressional offices that will take it over in the 119th Congress, which will begin at the end of January next year. And there are some shifts in terms of this election cycle. I know people have big feelings about it, but in terms of what's happening in Congress for the Education and Workforce Committee, which is where this bill is housed, there are some pretty big changes that we are very hopeful will shift and really allow it to see the light of day. Now, that said, I believe that regardless of what happens with this bill, the messaging for the bill is just as, if not more important than the end result. And I can talk about more about that later when I get to some of the messaging we've been able to do. So this is what the bill would do. It has 4 pillars. It would administer a competitive grant program to support civic bridge building programs across the nation. So what do we mean by bridge building? We mean, how do we bring communities together across lines of difference? That's the very simple definition. It would support a number of different areas, and I'll get to that. I'm going to show you some examples of what it would fund so you can see that. It would also support the training of AmeriCorps members. AmeriCorps has a tremendous force all across this nation. They do an incredible amount of work. I never knew the good that AmeriCorps does for this nation, and I'll give you 3 quick examples. If there is a hurricane, if there is a natural disaster, AmeriCorps is usually the first responder. When a Katrina happened, do you know who showed up first with water and baby diapers? It was AmeriCorps. For a number of different reasons, I won't go into all of it, but anyway, it was AmeriCorps who showed up first. If there's a forest fire on federal land, it is AmeriCorps firefighters, and most of those firefighters are actually military members who are transitioning from active duty service, coming back into civilian life, and many of those populate that fire corps. So they fight all of the fires that happen on federal land. They do controlled burns for the benefit of communities, and they do also do a lot of work actually with the VA. The VA gets its own amount of funding, obviously, to care for veterans, but a lot of the programs that support the life of veterans after they get back are actually administered through AmeriCorps. And through AmeriCorps Vista, a lot of children eat. So if you aren't in a community or in a state that feeds children for free through the schools, AmeriCorps Vista usually steps in to make sure those kids have food. So all of those AmeriCorps volunteers are embedded into local communities, and it would train them in these skills of being able to have conversation across lines of difference. for anyone who's concerned about fiscal responsibility, that is a very important. And I will say that the ROI, so the return on investment with AmeriCorps, for every $1 that taxpayers give AmeriCorps through the federal budget, AmeriCorps returns on average $17 back into the community. And in some places, it's as high as $34 and $36. And that's the power of those volunteers who are really working. It will also support academic research to make sure that the most efficacious methods of bridge building and of bringing communities together are being used. And it would help to activate a public conversation, kind of like we're having now. So here's an example of the type of program that the Building Civic Bridges Act would fund. This is called Team Up Project, and it's a project of Catholic Charities, Habitat for Humanity, Interfaith America, and YMCA of the USA. In 2023 to 2024, there were 30 communities in 23 states that engaged in service projects. And each of these different service projects was dependent upon the community. So I'll give you an example. In Minneapolis, they had a habitat build, but instead of just having one church or one synagogue or one temple come and work the build site, what they wanted to do was to create bridges between different religions. And so they had people from each of the different religions work together on one build site to really build understanding about what is it to be a Muslim? What is it to be a Christian? What is it to be Jewish? What is it to be Sikh? What is it to be Buddhist? What is it to be Baha'i? All of these different faiths that make up our freedom of religion. What does it mean to be that, and how can we build bridges between those different faiths? So they worked on a build site together, and then they had programming afterwards for the people that worked on the build site. Another example is in Cincinnati. There, I thought this was great. They worked with kids and music. So they brought kids from different pieces of the city to play in a band together, kids who would never have played music together ever. So they brought those kids from different parts of the city together to play in a band and to work on something that then each of those different bands came together and played for their parents and other members of the community, and they served food. But when the parents and the members of the community showed up, each of those little tables, they brought people from different parts of the city to sit together. So you didn't just sit with the people you knew, you sat with someone that you didn't know from a zip code that was not yours. And as you watched your kids perform in this music together, and then there was additional programming that flowed after that. So utilizing the arts, utilizing service. There's other examples where they bring community leaders together who wouldn't necessarily coexist or come across one another, but they bring them together for a series of conversations about what is life really like in your neighborhood? What do you need? What is happening? Or what is the work you're doing? What do you find beneficial? How can you move forward? So those are some examples from this work. It's not shifting. Hold on one second. So this is Raft for America. This was a very fun event that happened over the summer where they brought elected members of Congress from both sides of the aisle, as well as their constituents from both sides of the aisle, put them in a whitewater raft, and they had to row that boat to shore together. So literally having to do it. And I think one of the most powerful stories is the elected leaders usually showed up very buttoned up and official and professional. Then they'd get in the boat and they'd get wet. Sometimes they fell out, but they kept going. And then by the time they got out of the water, everyone in that boat was laughing and chummy and just hugging on each other. And then they sat down and they ate and talked about some of the issues that were facing the areas where they were at. And had some really beautiful conversations. The footage, I did not get to attend this, but I saw some of the footage from it. The conversations that people from very different parts of the aisle And all along the political spectrum, we're able to have about some of our hardest topics about reproductive rights, about abortion, about transgender rights, um, or about housing, about inflation, about all of these really difficult things. Those people were at a picnic table with a package of Lay's chips, having real conversations with their elected members of Congress. And they were not necessarily of the same party, but there was great understanding to be had. So that's a fun example. Civics education is also covered, K through 12 civic education, as well as higher education, so colleges and universities. Um, iCivics in CivicX Now is an organization founded by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. It's the largest civics coalition in the nation, and they do a lot of work to really emphasize civics education in the schools. And you can see from the slide, students who experience high quality civic education are more likely to complete college and develop skills. They're more likely to vote and actually discuss issues as opposed to being afraid to discuss those issues. And they're hard to discuss. I don't blame them, but they're more likely to try. They're more confident to speak publicly and to communicate with their elected officials, and they're more likely to volunteer and to work on community issues. So here we go back to that theme of, in that one slide, all politics may be national, but really and truly, we're talking about the community. We're talking about the community and how do we get back to neighbor on neighbor. Another thing it would support would be citizen assemblies, which is a way that common everyday people are selected to actually create the policy and to suggest policy. This was recently done in Tennessee, and there was a documentary made about it called the Tennessee 11. I highly suggest it. I don't know if it's on streaming platforms yet, but if not, it will be soon. And it shows how these people from across the spectrum in Tennessee got together and talked about gun control. And they actually came out with policies that everyone agreed on, and they shared them with their elected members of their state legislator, and some of them actually got passed. So how cool is that? Um, here's just a little bit of it works. It's been studied. Living Room Conversations is a really wonderful organization. I highly suggest them. They have conversation guides that you can do in your living room, hence the name. They work a lot with libraries and schools as well. The Fedster Institute did an 18-month study to really look at what happens when someone participates in one of these conversations, what happens immediately and what happens over time. And what they found is that it improves mindsets of the participants, it humanizes the other, and it increases mutual understanding and interest in systemic issues, which just means people are able to talk about the hard stuff. Civity is a similar program. They work a lot with city governments or mayor councils or leaders, universities and schools. And a Stanford study in 2022 found that their work increases social trust, reduces partisan animosity, and reduces support for undemocratic processes. So again, that goes back to the idea that when people feel heard, when they feel like they belong, they really participate in a different way. I'll skip this, we're going long. These are the official endorsers of the bill. You can see it's a lot of organizations, but the point that I want to pull out is that if you really dive deep into each of these organizations, what you'll see is that they cover the spectrum of American life. It is a hodgepodge of every type of organization in our nation. And this is different. Most bills, if it's a fiscal bill, it's businesses or it's people who are think tanks that are behind it. If you have something that's about agriculture, it's farming and that sort of John Deere who's behind it. This bill, it's everyone from across the spectrum. It's K through 12 education, higher education, it's mental health organizations, it's pro-democracy organizations, it's faith organizations, it's local community organizations, it's the YMCA, it's veterans organizations. It is all over the map. And the reason why, I believe, is because polarization is impacting us everywhere. There is no one that's not feeling it. And so when I look at this list, what I see is a call from all sorts of people to say, help, we got to do something. This is our congressional outreach, but I really feel like I should stop. I can go into this if you want and show you who's listening to this topic or not. What do you think, Julie?
Do you have it like just like a list or
Yeah,
how
yeah. You
you
want
can
to
just pop
see it
that
real
up
quick?
there if you want?
Okay.
Oh,
So
wow.
well, here's all the grass top organizations. So in addition to those organizations that have officially endorsed, there's several who can't. Um,
Mhm.
and so these are the organizations that we have been able to connect with their elected members of Congress. The ones in bold are ones that have actually joined us in Hill meetings. So I will say to you, if you are an organization working on the ground and this bill is something that might be the type of thing that you're interested in, let me know. The next time we have a meeting with someone who's in your district, um, I'll loop you in. I mean, this is the power. The elected members of Congress really want to hear from people on the ground. And there are some offices that I have that they are willing to have a meeting, but I have yet to connect with an organization in that district who so they won't let me have a meeting with them until I get constituents on the call. So they're just waiting. So I am happy, happy, happy to have that. Um, our grassroots outreach, we've had over 1,000 constituent letters from 34 states that have reached 218 members of Congress. And I will tell you, we have had meetings where we say, do you know this bill? And they will say, yes, because we've had parents write us. So people are being heard. These are 3 of the letters that we've received. I just pulled it out because they're pretty strong examples of people who have switched party affiliation or backed out of politics altogether, people who have witnessed violence. The one in the middle is a veteran who feels pretty bereft about what's going on. Here's our congressional engagement. These are all of the members of Congress with whom we have had meetings or who are co-sponsors of the bill. It is 102 people. Now, I will not say all of them that, they haven't jumped on board to co-sponsor, but some of them have, and I'll get to that slide. And the conversation continues. I just got an email from one congressional office. It's a Republican office, and they are being really careful. But they continue to ask questions and they continue to want to know. And that feels really good. When you get somebody who wants to know answers, that's a wonderful place to be in. So that list represents 102 members of Congress, 64 Democrats, 38 Republicans, and 1 independent from 43 states. You'll see there are some states on the map that are a lighter shade of red or a lighter shade of blue. Those are states where we have begun conversations with representatives, but have not yet actually met with them. So I don't include them on the list until we actually have a meaningful engagement. And here are the official co-sponsors right now. Todd Young out of Indiana and Chris Coons from Delaware are the leads in the Senate. Andy Barr from Kentucky and Derek Kilmer from Washington are the leads in the House. And then you'll see on the left-hand side all of the current co-sponsors, which translates into 24, 16 Democrats, 8 Republicans. And there are 10 co-sponsors on hold. And they are on hold because if you look at their party, they're all Democrats or Senator King from Maine, who's an independent, but he technically caucuses with the Democrats. And so therefore, what they're looking for is parity. They want to show bipartisanship and they want to show that this is something that is being brought up by everyone. So we're waiting on Republicans to step forward and join in a sort of Noah's Ark style. And this is me. And then that's my colleague from the National Civic League as well. So please feel free to reach out to me for anything. And I don't know if I'm over time or not, Julie, but that's the end of my dog and pony.
All right, well, we can get into a couple questions. We have some from the chat, and then, we had some that we had prepared ahead of time.
Mhm.
Um, and some of the ones from the chat I kind of thought were pretty good. Because, and I'll start with one of those. People are getting some canned responses from their legislators, and they want to know, kind of what to do about that. And then what's the best way for contacting senators and reps? And is it different between local and federal, or is it different just between person to person?
Um, so how to contact and then can't, and when they do contact, they're getting canned answers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let me talk about canned answers first.
Mm-hmm.
Usually what happens in my experience is that when you contact the elected rep, you'll pretty quickly get a canned response that just says, we got it, heard. And then a little later, and each office is going to be different depending on the size of their staff and how
Mm-hmm.
many people they have working, you'll usually get something else. And I will also say the degree to which you put in terms of like, this is what I want to talk to you about. This is why I want to talk to you about it. These are the reasons I want to talk to you about it. The more you are clear in what you're trying to say and give to them, the more likely they will come back. If it's just something short, like, I really want Pepsi to be named national mascot of the United States. Okay, great. But if you put in all your reasons and why you feel like this is important and, or that Snoopy should be president, whatever it is, that the deeper you go, the more likely you're going to get something clear. There was one woman who wrote a letter in favor of the bill, and she's a Gold Star daughter. And her letter, oh Lord, just thinking about it makes me cry.
Mm-hmm.
She And I think that this actually gets to the heart of why this is important. She said, I did not lose my father. I did not grow up without my daddy who gave his life to this country to watch this country tear itself apart. Please do something.
Mm-hmm.
Her letter was first met by a canned response. Then they sent her an email. Then they called her. And then they called her twice. And then they called her three times until she actually picked up and they were actually able to have a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Other people, like I've written a letter, just through, we have an advocacy tool on our website. I wrote a letter. I got a canned response, and then I got something a little more thorough a few more weeks later that was essentially like, we're looking at it. Thank you so much for writing. What I know is that though, if I just sent that, that might feel a little disheartening. I might go, well, I wanted change and I wrote my letter and I need something big. But what I know is that what they're doing is they're gathering where are they getting messages from their constituents?
Mm-hmm.
And what topics are constituents really talking about? And when they get really heartfelt, well-reasoned stuff out and they get a lot of it, they pay attention. And I'll give you another example. I talked with one staffer and he said that there was an organization that has a lot of money that had a huge letter writing campaign, but every letter said the same thing. And when people called the office, it was the same script. And when the staffers would say, well, okay, well, tell me about that. Why is that important to you? The people who were calling would just say, I don't know. This is just what they told me to say. So that staffer, he said, guess how many, call all of those calls and all of those letters, guess how many that actually counted for really and truly?
One.
One, because it was the same message. He said, but when we get a letter that's really from a constituent, that's
Mm-hmm.
really from their heart, because it is so rare that they get them, that when they do, he said, guess how much that counts for? 100.
Mm,
They figure if they get one really well reasoned out letter that is thought out and thought through and really is grounded in what's happening in their community, that there has to be at least 100 other people who feel the same way.
mhm, mhm.
Um, so it's just realize, and this is hard because we live in an age where so much information comes back to us so quickly. So you have to have faith. You
Mhm.
have to have faith that the messaging you are giving will be met by others who feel the same way and will be heard.
And just as an addendum to that, it doesn't have to be perfect prose or anything of that nature. Heartfelt, like you said, is what really, really matters.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
let's talk about and dive into about how incivility hurts us all in terms of, you brought this up on your slides, the economic loss, the national security and democracy. Many of us know that incivility is a huge problem, but not to the extent that it actually impacts us all. So what are some specific examples of how it impacts our economy or national security or even our community health? I think probably community health we saw during COVID a lot.
Yeah. We did.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of what's driving things these days is the fact that we've splintered as a community. I mean, look, how many of us live in a space where we have our home, we get in a car, the garage door opens, we leave the garage, we go to a box store that's across town with full of people, none of whom are our neighbors. And then we get back in the car, drive into the garage door goes down. And so unless you have a toddler or a dog that you're walking, where do it's difficult to see your neighbors. And there is it's so beautiful when that connection happens, that you run into someone that you didn't expect to run into at the grocery store or on the street. And I would posit that those random interactions are actually some of the most important interactions that we have,
Hmm.
because they remind us that we are a community, we are neighbors, and that we have something to share,
Hmm.
and that we're human. We haven't met just because of, we're fighting about a topic. We're just human. Yeah.
Hmm.
I saw someone said there are no accidents.
Hmm. That's
I,
that's accurate. So this past election, as you've said a couple times, we saw the use of racism and sexism and attacks on marginalized communities to generate fear and division to win votes. So what do you say to people who rightfully don't want to build a bridge to someone who is racist or who supports elected officials who advocate for policies that will actually hurt them or someone that they care about? How do you foster that conversation? Sorry, I'm catching a cold, y'all.
oh no, feel better. Um, there's a lot of answers to this question, because I don't think every single one of those things that you mentioned is the same answer.
Mhm,
And I also don't think that within each one of those things that there's one way or no way. Meaning, first of all, you have to be ready. If you're not ready to have conversations, don't have them.
mhm,
And if you don't feel safe, you then probably you're not ready to have a conversation. Um, I know that there's a lot of grieving that's happened after this election. um, from actually, and anger from actually people from all parts of the spectrum. There's a lot of just angry people, even people whose candidate won the election, they're still angry. And people who didn't win the election, their candidate didn't win the election, they're angry. Everybody's angry.
mhm,
Um, and so if that's where you're at, I think it's important. to honor that's where you're at. So
Mhm.
self-awareness is really important, number one. But when you're ready to engage, there are reasons that I would encourage you to do it. And I'll give you some specific examples if that's all right. And then I can give you some um, tactics if it helps. Um, I have a sitter, and she's Mexican American. She is a citizen of this nation, but she has family members who are not.
Mhm.
She is also a lesbian, and obviously there is a lot that was under attack for who she is in this world. And she had an aunt and an uncle who voted for someone on the other side of the political spectrum,
Mhm.
someone that makes her feel unsafe personally. And she, after the election, was really, really upset. And she said, I don't know how I talk to my aunt and my uncle anymore. They helped to raise me, but I don't know how I talk to them anymore. Um, and we had a lot of conversations about it. And one of the things that I shared with her is I asked, and this is one of the things that I would say in general is really important when you're having conversations across lines of difference, is to get curious.
Mhm.
Because the more we enter into conversations in a posture of defense, where we're trying to show someone how they're not right. I don't know about you, but when someone tries to tell me how I'm not right, I'm not likely to listen to them. Like, I don't want to be in that conversation. So, so the more we can be curious,
Mhm.
the more it opens up possibilities. But again, you got to be ready for that.
Right.
So in this sense, she was really upset because her aunt and her uncle mean something to her, and
Mhm.
yet they did something that hurt her personally and made her feel unsafe, and she couldn't reconcile the two.
Mhm.
And I said, well, do you know why your aunt and your uncle made the decision that they did? And she thought about it because she hadn't thought, like, why. And she said, well, I guess it was the economy and because of the bravado, like this masculine bravado.
Mhm.
Um, and she said, well, and she realized that those reasons had nothing to do with her, but they still impacted her. And
Right.
I said, well, do you think that your aunt and uncle connected the dots of how their decision, if it was made because of bravado and because of something to do with the economy, their belief on it, do you feel like that they connected that dot of how it impacted you?
Mhm.
And she said, no, I don't think they did. And I said, well, if you don't talk to them anymore, are they ever going to connect that dot?
Great question.
And going back to that topic of community.
Mhm.
When people, we are designed to want community.
Mhm.
And if we do not feel that we are a part of a community, we will find a place to be a part of community.
Mhm.
And so if you exercise someone from your life because they made a decision, what community do they have left?
Mhm.
And where will they go? And where will they seek their identity?
Wow. Well, we actually are over time.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, don't apologize. This was a great talk. People are really engaged. Everybody, is really, listening. I think if you are willing, and I'll talk to Julie, we need to have you back for part two because there's more that we could talk about
Sure.
in terms of how to bridge this. Because, I see someone who says, nope, these folks are this or that, and nope, there's no way to talk to them. And that may be true in that case. I don't know. But it may not be, it may still be because there are many who are going through the 5 stages of grief. This is a grieving process, y'all. So, some of us are stuck in anger at this moment. Um, Large swaths of us are. A lot of women who look like me said they're sitting back and not doing nothing for the next 4 years. And I know that's not true because that's not our nature. So, but that's what we're saying in the moment. So, but I think that we should have you back if you're willing. One of the things that I would ask is if you could recommend some resources and send them to Julie so that when she sends out the follow-up email to everyone, they'll have those resources from you, and how to contact you and all of that. And then also, are your slides available? Because folks were asking about that.
Oh yeah, yeah, I'll clean them up. There's
Okay,
some.
and then send those to Julie as well, and she'll send that out. And then this recording will be gone through with our person. We have a tech team, and they'll clean it up and clean up any mistakes or whatever that I've done. And it'll be out on our YouTube channel in a few days. So you can go back and watch it if there's anything that you missed or anything that you wanted to go back over. So, but Kara, thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for everything that you shared. This is a great topic. And like I said, we need to have a part two.
We'll talk nuts and bolts
I know,
on how to.
right? Yeah, yeah. Next one is the nuts and bolts of it. Yeah, and that's what maybe that's what we should call it. All right. Well, thank you so much,
Thank you.
and thank you everyone for sharing your time. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so I'll just say good night.